Okay, so let's start today with the first seminar of the year. So thank you for coming. And today we will have Andrea Santangeli. He's a postdoc researcher at Marie Curie now, but he will start soon with Monica Hall at the Animal Demography and Ecology Unit, working with birds. Yes. So thank you very much, Andrea, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me here, and it's really my biggest pleasure to be here and talk finally after 1.5 years that I'm here to this group and to these people. So this project is part of my Marie Curie project, which is about integrating animal movement with life history data in order to understand their survival of vultures mostly. And I will speak mostly about this project, but I will also introduce a little bit about myself, since it's the first time that I speak to you, and probably not many of you know what I do and who I am and so on. And then I will talk about some really exciting ideas that I want to develop in the near to a bit longer term future. So about me, this is actually from my Google Scholar. It's mostly I do conservation science, so this is my passion since many years, and I've been mostly doing it on different tangents. It's very much multidisciplinary. I work mostly with birds, but not only, and it's very much applied. So I do ecology, conservation science that has some relevance for management for conservation. So this is my main driving motivation for science. I did a master's degree in the University of East Anglia in the UK a while ago already on this bird, the little bastards. Then I moved to Finland. I studied this species, but more than the species, I studied the approach during my PhD, which was about really quantifying the cost effectiveness of different conservation interventions for different species in contrasting socio-ecological landscapes where people also play a role. So it's not only about birds and mammals and so on, but it's also about people. Then I went to Namibia. I started to work with vultures in Southern Africa. Well, I went partly I was based in Finland, and I needed some escape to the south from the Finnish winter. So I thought that this is a nice place. I started to follow vultures there. We started to ring chicks, putting wing tags like these. We started to place camera traps to recite these birds that were marked with these wing tags. And then eventually we ended up with a large database of life histories of these birds, which we needed to analyze. And the problem was that some of these birds at some points lose these tags. And then if you want to understand, for example, the survival at the population level, you have to account for this. Otherwise, all those birds that have lost the tag are considered as dead, but in fact, they are in reality, they are alive. They are just without this tag. So this was a problem that I started to think of, and it wasn't really easy to solve it. But thankfully, in the group of Giacomo, there was Anna who published a paper addressing this kind of problem with the vulture in the Canary Island, I think that year or the year before. So after reading that paper, I contacted her. She invited me here, and then I spent 1 week with her. We addressed that issue, and we saw quite clearly with the data we gathered on the residings of these birds. It was more than 800 vultures from Namibia. We saw that the probability of losing this wing tag, which basically it's a cattle tag, what we use for the vultures, starts to increase after the birth, after the tag age becomes more than like 5 to 7 years old. So this is a problem because we mark these birds as chicks, and once they reach the adult age, they start to lose the tag. So obviously, when analyzing and estimating survival, if you don't account for that, you would have a strong underestimation of the survival, which in this case without accounting for this loss of the tag with the approach that Anna developed, you would have a much lower survival probability compared to the real value, which is close to 1, because this is a long-lived species, and of course it has a very high survival, especially in terms of the adults. But this was just kind of giving you an introduction of how I ended up here, and also how in the first place, and also about the approach and the topic. Then, of course, thinking about this approach and the data and so on, I started to develop this idea of this project Survivalist to mobilize larger scale data on different species from different populations. I applied to Marie Curie, and eventually I moved here. And now we go more into the real project, which basically the main driving motivation was that we really know very little about the full life cycle of animals. There is not many studies that are addressing the full life cycle. So not only, for example, in terms of birds, most of the studies are about the breeding season, but not so much in the winter or in the migration period for those that are migrating species. At the same time, we have a huge amount of data that are accumulating from biologging projects. So projects where they put the tags on the individuals, and they follow their movements across the landscape. For example, for raptors, there are very many across Europe, and especially for vultures. This is also because these are large birds, so they can bear the cost of carrying these transmitters. And also, so far, most of these projects that have been tracking birds, they have been using the data only to study their movement, their migration, eventually the use of the landscape, habitat suitability, and so on. But very rarely these data have been used to quantify survival, and especially at the life cycle level. So this is basically what I wanted to do, kind of use this kind of movement data to fill this gap. This is a paper that was published in PNAS a few years back, showing, it's a bit complicated, this figure, but it shows how little we know about the demography, especially the survival of most of the species of birds across the world. So this is basically the percentage of those that we know quite well, the survival, for example. And of course, I like birds. I work mostly with birds, but not only. And vultures are the study species of this project. I mostly focused on the European vultures. So the Cinereous vulture, the Griffon vulture, and the bearded vulture. In Europe, we have also these other species, but I didn't really address it because there was another group working on it on a similar topic. And these two species we actually do have in Mallorca, this one and this one. You can see them sometimes even in sporeless. They are most of the species are endangered according to IUCN, and the main causes of the main threats of these species are mostly poisoning, not direct poisoning. So people are not intending to kill vultures, but they put poisons within these human-wildlife conflicts. So they want to kill jackals or foxes or wolves or bears, and put poison in the landscape. And of course, vultures, which are the only obligate scavengers across the vertebrates in the whole world, they gather in big numbers at these places where they can find carcasses, obviously. And in this way, they get poisoned. There is other threats like collision, mortality with wind turbines, with power lines, and sometimes with other infrastructures. So there is a kind of a series of threats that these birds have to face somehow in the landscape. So it's a kind of really landscape of threat, if you want. And these species are very important. I cannot kind of estimate more or highlight more how important these species are for the ecosystem. This was actually an expert survey that I did during the pandemic everybody was working at home. So I basically made an online survey to quantify the ecosystem services of vultures across the world. And it's really clear that vultures really provide important services, especially in terms of recycling waste, also controlling diseases and reducing smell. And this is because, of course, they rapidly consume carcasses, dead animals, even human waste, and in doing that, prevent the spread of diseases, the spread of smells, and clean up the environment from this rotting material. So we will go back to this, especially this controlling diseases, because I will present something, some future research lines that I want to work on. They also serve cultural services, not only in terms of existence values or non-monetary services, but for example, in some cultures, they also have a spiritual value and so on. So they are very important. And in terms of the regulation and maintenance services, now we are starting to appreciate that they also contribute to regulate the climate, because by naturally disposing of carcasses, like in this case, we don't need to actually dispose of these carcasses of, for example, livestock in the countryside ourselves. And this artificial disposal of carcasses, according to, for example, European regulations, sanitary regulations, causes quite a large amount of greenhouse gas emissions, because you need to collect these carcasses from the landscape with small trucks. You need to bring them to usually intermediate plants, and then you have to carry them to incineration stations, which costs money and, of course, fuel, so carbon emissions. In this case, we studied the mitigation of the emissions by vultures in Sardinia. So this is just the context how of the species that we are going to see. And so back to the project, the primary aim of this project was to quantify the variation in survival in across the annual cycle of the 3 species of vultures that I mentioned before, so across the breeding season, the non-breeding season, and also across the life stages. So during the phases where there are juveniles, immatures, and also adults. Then there are other objectives, which I will not tackle at this during this course of this presentation, and it's about quantifying the causes of mortality, and also understanding a bit better the correlates of mortality in terms of in which type of conditions and context does mortality occur. Does it occur, for example, in countries which have weaker regulations in terms of, for example, of control of corruption, or but there could be more poisoning? Does mortality occur more in areas which have higher implementation and development of wind turbines because the vultures collide with those? So these are all kind of important aspects, but I will focus now on survival. And as I mentioned before, I basically gathered data from across more than 50 collaborators and many projects across the whole Europe, including the Middle East, harmonized this movement data, gathered life history data, so metadata on a single individual in terms of, for example, the age of the individual, when it was captured, the sex of the individual, whether it was rehabilitated or not, captive bred, and so on. And then I focused, of course, on different populations, and I performed this survival modeling at this point with a non-fate, but we are going to do a bit more advanced approaches in the coming months. And these are basically an overview of the data that we mobilized. So it's over 1,300 individual birds from the 3 species overall, and different populations of the 3 species. And what we can see here is that for the Griffon vulture, across the three populations, we have a relatively high and constant survival of the adults, and also pretty much for the immatures beside in the Middle East. And for the juveniles, we have mostly high survival across in the East and the Middle East populations, but slightly lower for the Western population, which is basically the Iberian, French, and also partly Italian population of this species. We still have to think a little bit how to interpret these results. These are kind of preliminary. But overall, these are indicative of healthy populations because these species are actually long-lived, so you would expect this kind of high survival rates. And this is also pretty much a similar picture for the other species, the largest vulture that we have in Europe, where survival is constantly high, well over 80. And also well over 90, 95 for the adults. And this is the bearded vulture, which was the last species, the third species that we addressed. The same survival was quite high, and this is also indicative of eventually a population that is recovering or stable. The next steps, what I'm basically engaged now, I'm using this tracking data, so the movement data of the birds to see where they went through the life, and then I extract some landscape parameters, like for example, the human influence index, to see if basically this kind of environment that they experience during their life can actually affect their survival probabilities. And we will implement also with Anna and Giacomo some more advanced survival modeling approaches for this. This project also kind of opened the way to more questions, and the one was about issues with the data. So I spent about 1 year trying to collect this data, but also harmonize them, because of course from different projects, sometimes birds were shared between projects, sometimes the same bird was occurring in 2 different projects with different names and so on. So then last summer, I was in the Max Planck in Germany discussing with colleagues who were actually starting a platform for kind of addressing this problem using a kind of so-called animal identifier. It's a kind of passport, really, like we have for ourselves, specific for each individual bird that has been marked or that has been known to science. And this could really help if everybody at some point start to use this kind of system. And they also, at the Max Planck, they are starting to implement a platform for doing that and to gather all this life history data on the individuals so that this becomes basically all digitized and standardized, rather than, for example, me having to spend 1 year harmonizing this data. I could just, if they were all uploaded there, I could just download them and use them for this kind of survival modeling, for example, in a much more efficient way. But this is, of course, it's a little bit futuristic, but it's a paper that is now under review, and we hope that in the near future it will take over. A bit like platforms like MoveBank that I used to store and standardized tracking movement data of animals. So I tried to keep it quite short because I know that a lot of people want to go for beer or for family. And these are the conclusions, but it's not over yet. So in Europe, especially, these kind of results are really indicative of a conservation success, because there has been a huge amount of money spent on vultures in different projects, different reintroduction projects, captive breeding, protection of nests, and so on, across the whole Europe, from west to east. And people have been working really hard over the past 30, 40 years to bring back these populations of vultures, which we have now in Europe. So we can enjoy now seeing these vultures also in Mallorca, which would have probably not been possible without without this kind of conservation efforts to some extent. And these results really kind of put a mark on those efforts that say, well, look, you made these efforts, this is the result, the outcome. So the outcome is actually quite positive. We see that the survival, it's fairly good for this species. So this is basically the main message. And this is a kind of project that is not related to my Marie Curie, but that I have been thinking about since basically I started working in Namibia, and I started to understand a little bit the system, how it works. So what happens is that when you have a carcass, you have a congregation of vultures that come to feed at this carcass. And vultures can be really efficient, as I said before. They can destroy, they can consume this carcass within minutes, half an hour, 1 hour. Even a cow carcass can disappear in 1 hour if there is vultures around. And by doing that, they prevent the transmission of diseases among mesopredators like jackals in this case, could be foxes, could be even feral dogs that carry rabies and so on. So what happened is that everybody, or a lot of people in the conservation community, in the vulture community, are talking about this disease regulation of vultures. You have seen previously the figures about the ecosystem role, the disease regulation role of vultures, but empirically this has never been experimentally tested. So we know that it makes logic sense, right? You remove the carcasses from the environment, you don't have a ground for the mesopredators to come feed at those carcasses and interact with each other, share diseases. But it has never been experimentally tested. So what I was planning to do is to run a large field experiment in sites where vultures are present and vultures are not present, but where there is the same community of mesopredators. Carcass experiments by manipulating carcasses, tracking them with camera traps, and then catch a mesopredator species that I think the best, for example, if doing it in Africa is the jackal, because it's very abundant and quite easy to catch. So catch them, follow them with transmitters, and then take samples for different diseases that are transmittable among the other jackals, but also among livestock and so on. So once you catch them and test them for the disease, you release them, they go in the landscape, they move around, eventually they get infected. And this infection, this is quite exciting. This paper was done on the African swine fever and wild boars in Belgium, where they could actually track the various phases of the infection from when the animal was healthy until when the animal was started to get in contact with other sick animals, getting sick, and then eventually progressively died. So this is a measure of the activity of the wild boar. So basically this tells us that by GPS tracking the animals, we can at least follow the various infection phases. And that's what I was planning to do with some of these diseases, like for example, rabies, which is eventually very strong disease because it leads to rapid death of the animals. You can actually follow these animals until they die, and once they die, you can track back the interaction of these animals based on their movement and the movement of the other animals, and you can see how they interacted with and with whom they interacted with. And in that at that level, you can actually infer that, okay, if you have more interactions and more transmissions and more individuals dying of a specific disease in the treatment group, which is for example the one without vultures, you can infer that this disease regulation is in fact related to the vulture's role in the ecosystem. So I think that this is it sounds quite challenging, but I have it more or less in mind how to address it. I just need some funding to do that, and quite a lot of funding. But yeah, I would like to thank you for listening, and all the collaborators, of course, the group and the IMEDEA and various other organizations like Vulture Conservation Foundations, Max Planck also. Thank you.
Any questions?
I had a question about the, well, I mean, I know nothing about vultures, etc., but about the methods, like when you, so you showed us the different mortality rates, well, mortality in the various phases, in the juvenile, immature, and adult. I guess that in the case of the adult, if an animal dies of natural death, it should be considered as that it survives, right? In the, I mean, in the numbers, if a vulture will at a certain point die because of old age. And so how can you know, I mean, when you have to calculate those percentage, how do you know if a vulture died of natural death or of poisoning or of, I mean, how can you distinguish the cause of death?
Those data that I show, they show the overall survival. So it doesn't distinguish between the natural versus anthropogenic mortality. So we don't really analyze separately survival related to different causes of death.
But then so this 97% is the amount of animals that survived a certain threshold. So we say if the
it's annual survival.
Eh?
So it's annual survival rate. So 97% means that an animal survives through the year with 97% probability. So there is a 3% chances that it dies. So this is.
But also you have like a threshold age that when it's considered to be an adult.
Yes.
And then after
yes,
that.
yes, we know when they start breeding. Okay. It's usually at the year 6. So, but we have another plan to analyze the causes of mortality with this data also. And for some of the, not all of the incidences where the birds died, we know the causes of mortality, whether it was poisoning, wind collision, infrastructure, and so on. Yeah.
Thank you. What is the, just a curiosity, what is the life expectancy of a vulture?
I think they can live more than 30 years even. Yes, so they are very long-lived species. As I said just before, they start breeding only when they are 6 or 7 years old. In some conditions they make only one egg per year. They sometimes don't even breed every year. If the conditions are not good, they skip and they breed every other year. So they are very long-lived.
And just a curiosity about your statistics. What is the minimum sample of vultures that you need to have these studies?
That's a good question. I think that we aim to have as much data as possible. And then based on the data we have, we decided what's feasible and what's not. But it doesn't make sense, for example, start to split the populations and have a population with 10 individuals. It's clearly too little.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Regarding particularly this last part that you showed about the boxes that were sick or the project that you actually proposed. I'm just curious if anyone has ever looked if you can infer if one of those animals is sick just by the track of the movements. I would assume that an animal with a disease would move in a shorter range, or a healthy one will cover larger ranges.
Yeah. So this is what I maybe I wasn't really explicit enough, but this is what they did. They put tracking units, so GPS tracks on wild boars, and they follow their activity. So it's not really exactly related to the specific distance or so, but it includes various activity patterns, including the distance that they move in a day. So, because obviously when you're sick, you move less. You're tired. Swine fever, African swine fever, is exactly like a very strong influencer for this species. So yeah, they move less, and you can clearly see it here when they start to get this viremia state, and they move less and less, and they are less active until they die. So yeah, this gave me even more impetus to start finally getting this project up and running, because I think that now it's really a good time to make use of these technologies to eventually address these questions, which wouldn't be possible maybe even 10 years ago.
Finally, good news for conservation. No? When you say that there's been a lot of effort to reintroduce, sustain these populations, and now the survival is very high, so apparently they look very healthy. But how was the figure before? I mean, were these populations on the edge of extinction, or there were some spot in which they are more healthy?
Yes, so many of so these three species of vultures, like 20 years ago, there were much fewer across Europe, and they were mostly declining. So we don't have really solid data to kind of compare with the present situation, but many of the species were much more scarce, and some were extinct in some areas, like for example the Cinereous vulture was extinct in the east, and then it was reintroduced. So they clearly occupied a much wider extent across Europe than yeah.
And did the legislation change in the last year about the using of venom, for example? I think that very lightheartedly we use venom to kill rats, for example, but this then goes, I mean, up in the chain. And I mean, I don't know if like rat venom can affect vultures. But...
So the problem is that these poisons are all illegal to use for off the label. So you can buy a rat poison and use it off the label. So it means that if I buy a rat poison, I need to use it for the rat. If I want to use it to kill a wolf, that becomes illegal.
But how do I control who eats? For example, here our cat died because of the rat venom that we used at an institute. So, I mean, how do you check that the venom?
It's very hard.
El gato.
You have to.
Okay.
So your cat died.
No, the cat of the Medea, the one that we had 2 years ago. The black cat died because of the venom that we put for the rat. I mean,
Is that a solid? Is that a solid sentence? Or?
no, Ines told me. There you go. No, I mean, it got poisoned by someone, and I didn't.
Yeah, but the answer is it's illegal and it's very hard to control.
Yeah.
Even in Europe. But there are some cases of sentences of people have been even imprisoned because of using poisons. I think even in Spain. Yeah.
Well, for example, it's very particular the law because here in Spain you can use the venom, the poison in your house, for example, but as soon as you put it in the garden, then you need a special person that comes and put the poison for you. You can't do it; it would be illegal.
So you can use it for your husband also.
Yeah. And, so you can use it in the day, but not outside. Unless the cat enters the day.
One curiosity also for this project. Was anyone speaking? No, yes, for this project, I wonder if there is any sensor, like physiologic sensor, you could use also to track the disease. Like, I don't know, like the smart watch that, I don't know, having the heartbeat of animals or their temperature to know if they have fever or not. I wonder if there is.
Yeah, I'm sure there are. Yes, I need to check. Yes, there are also mortality sensors that now can be applied to these GPS tracking units. So they inform you when the animal is most likely died. It's not 100% sure, but they help. So yes. Yes. So I think that can help, and also the movement. But of course, you cannot track everything. I mean, the diseases are very different, and some you can track with some affect the activity, but some, like maybe echinococcus, doesn't really affect so much the activity in the short term. So you need to probably take samples of the animals before and after.
Question about it. So, how much time do you need to keep track of this? Because as it depends on the disease, is there like a minimum period that you should get very fast?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, so I was thinking about several sites, so control and treatment, and probably at least a year. But it depends a lot on the disease as well. So I put a list of diseases. I think that we can try to address all of these diseases, and then at the end we'll see only later on how it goes, because it's not easy. Sometimes you don't have any cases of rabies within a year, and then suddenly you have an explosion of rabies and everybody gets infected. So it's a bit unpredictable. So I would say the longer the better. But of course, these tracking units also don't last very long, especially if you want high resolution data, like GPS points every like 1 hour or something. So it's a bit of a trade-off. But now with modern technologies, I think it's possible also to extend this period a bit longer.
Okay, so we can leave it here and go for some years. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.